It now gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, the Honourable John Samuel Letts Dawkins, MLC JP. I didn't realise he was Samuel Letts, so that was good. Yeah. John was born in Gawler in 1954 and he grew up on a farm at Gawler River and attended PAC and Gawler High and Glen Ormiston Agricultural College is where?
In Western Victoria.
Western Victoria, yeah, we all knew that. And he studied Associate Diploma in Farm Management as well as at Adelaide TAFE, studying also freelance journalism. Dark horse. Before being elected to Parliament, John became a primary producer, later on following on to become electoral officer with the Honourable Neil Andrew MP, Honourable Alexander Downer MP and Senator Honourable Nick Minchin. John was involved in the farming of stud Dorsets and Suffolk sheep at Gawler River. He was also involved in a range of agricultural groups, including the Australian Society of Breeders of British Sheep. He was elected to the Legislative Council in the South Australian Parliament on the 11th of October 1997. 20 years and a bit. John has been the opposition whip to the Upper House since 2002. John's a Justice of the Peace, and in 2006 he was awarded a Paul Harris Fellowship from the Rotary International. Well done. He's been involved with Rotary Club at Gawler, Two Wells Football and Netball Sporting Clubs, Adelaide Plains Football League, Salvation Army Red Shield Appeal, Operation Flinders, Gawler River Uniting Church, Gawler Tourism and Trade Authority, and the Northern Agricultural Shows Association. And John is currently serving on committees such as Joint Parliamentary Service Committee, Natural Resources Committee, the Select Committee on the Inquiry into the Corporation of the City of Burnside, and the Select Committee on Lonsdale-based Adelaide Desalination Plant. John is the Liberal spokesman for suicide prevention, Legislative Council Opposition Whip, and Joint Liberal Party Secretary. He enjoys his work along with the company of his two recent grandchildren. I thought that Gawler's long association with the Legislative Council needs explaining, and who best to ask to address us on this important historic issue. And it gives me great pleasure to ask John Dawkins to address us tonight. Thank you, John.
Well, look, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by the numbers in the group. I brought some extra material with me in hard copy, I suppose, and Brian wasn't very helpful in telling me how many people would be here, and I brought 20 copies, but obviously this is being done. The material, and I will apologise now that I'll probably read more tonight than I generally do when I make a speech. I don't read too many speeches at all, but because there's quite a bit of detail in here, I think it's best to get it right. And if I get it wrong, Bruce Easter will correct me. He's already been very helpful tonight. There are a number of other Legislative Council people who are mentioned in the history of Gawler and who are mentioned in dispatches as having maybe some connection to Gawler, even if they just visited and opened the show or something. But what I did in conjunction with the Parliamentary Library, who are a terrific library under the current director of the library, John Westy, it has made itself much more accessible to not only the members of Parliament but to the public. And I haven't mentioned this to Brian, but if at some stage this group would like to visit Parliament House and see the building generally, but spend some time having a look at the Parliamentary Library and the history that's there, gobsmacks me, and I'm sure it's I mean, it's not just history about South Australia, but there's fabulous history going way back before, and So I'm sure that if you wanted to work with me on that, we need to do it during the day, but we can work together on that if you would like. Yeah, it is a great privilege to do this, and I've learnt a bit more. I have added one tonight because Bruce has given me a little bit more detail about one that I'll come to at the end. But I will be reading a fair bit of this, and I apologise for that. The first one that I will mention that's with a significant Gawler connection of all these people, with significant Gawler connections who have served in the Legislative Council. And the first one is Walter Duffel, and that name will be known to just about everybody in this room. Walter Duffel was born in Essex in England in 1816, and he died in Gawler in 1882. He served in the House of Assembly from the first representative parliament, so the first when proper self-government was given in 1857. He served from 1857 to 1871 in the then seat of Barossa, which was a multi-member seat for most of the time. I'm not sure that it was always multi-member, but it certainly was for a very long period of time. And he then, following that, so he actually had, so from 1857 to 1871, and then he had, not entirely sure whether he lost his seat, but they were times before political parties, and people were tossed in and out fairly regularly, and governments changed hands pretty quickly because there was no political party structure, and as much as some people might say that might be a good thing, the reality is what it meant was that a lot of those governments and administrations didn't last very long. So he obviously hadn't had enough, so a couple of years later he came back into the, 2 years later, in April 1873, he was elected to the Legislative Council and served there until 1880. He was, of course, known as a miller, pastoralist, as well as a politician, and he arrived in South Australia on the William Barras in December 1839. Not long after he arrived, he took charge of Mr. Jacob Hagan's estate at Echunga, and was one of the first manufacturers of wine from the produce of South Australian vineyards. Right from the word go, he was a keen politician, and in the days before before self-government, he took a prominent part in some determined contests in a seat called Gawler, and there were a couple of very heavily contested votes that were all around state aid to religion. And his candidates were both in opposition to state aid to religion. And the quotes were, "This last election settled the question of church grants forever, and when it is recollected that elections then were by open voting, and that the successful candidate only won by a majority of 3 votes, the excitement that prevailed may be imagined." Such contests didn't hinge exclusively on the question of state aid to religion, but paved the way for our present constitution, and of course the first parliament under self-government constitution, as I said, was held in 1857. He is described as being a politician who was independent and fearless, and never shrank from taking what for the time was the unpopular side of the question. He was popular for his liberal views, and as a practical businessman he represented Barossa, as I said, for some 14 years. He was treasurer in John Hart's ministry for 5 months in 1865-66, and under Sir James Bowco for 12 months in 1866-67. His first noted legislation was the 1867 Dog Act, which remained unamended until 1884. And Bruce, I found that remarkable, because one of the most contentious things you can ever have legislation on in Parliament, it doesn't matter what Parliament is dogs and cats. It really does create disharmony. You find so many different people on a different side of the fence whenever legislation to do with dogs or cats is brought forward. As I said, he was elected to the Legislative Council in 1873 and resigned on the 5th of March 1880 on the urgent advice of his family doctor. Not quite sure what the situation was, but he did live for another 2.5 years after that urgent advice. And maybe it was a good thing for him to get out of the place, and that helped him live a bit longer. We now come to another very well-known name, James Martin. And James Martin is very well known, I suppose, in this town as an industrialist, as a leader of this town, but perhaps less so as for his political career. He was a member of the House of Assembly for 3 years, 1865 to 1868, in that seat of Barossa that I mentioned earlier, but he obviously lost that seat. He then had a 17-year sabbatical. He had eased himself away from politics, but in 1885 he returned to Parliament, to the Legislative Council, and served there for some 14 years. He was, of course, known as an engineer, a manufacturer and politician. He was actually born in Foundry in Cornwall, England, so the town was actually called Foundry, and it sort of gives a bit of a background. His father had died before his birth, but had run the foundry, which gave the village its name. He had a significant industrial background, and of course he was, one of the things he was well known for was the invention of what was initially called a man machine, and that was basically a kind of elevator which was widely adopted in hazardous mines. His company, of course, James Martin and Co, as well as being extensive here in Gawler, spread to Corn and Gladstone. He famously won a government contract in 1888 to construct 52 locomotives, and his trains were beautifully designed and served to launch James Martin and Co to the peak of its success. He was elected Mayor of Gawler several times and was a leading member and patron of most of the town's organisations. As I said, he represented Barossa in the House of Assembly, and then he was elected to what was then called the North Eastern Province of the Legislative Council. In 1865 he had supported Goyder's valuations of the pastoral runs, and I'm sure there are people here who have read the books about Goyder's exploits in the pastoral areas. If not, it's a fascinating read. He supported Goyder's valuations of the pastoral runs in 1885, a protective tariff, both popular causes, but by 1894 he had moved to the right. On the hustings he criticised the Labor Party and favoured the program of the Conservative National Defence League, which endorsed his candidature. His greatest parliamentary achievement was to secure the construction of the Barossa Reservoir, which supplied Gawler with water from 1902. And I've got to say that as someone who grew up at Gawler River, we had old pipeworks out there from the Barossa Waterworks, which was the original water that was reticulated onto our farming area. It came from the Barossa Reservoir. As we know, in 1903 a statue with the inscription, a tribute to his public worth, was placed in Murray Street, and it now stands on the banks of the South Parra River. Another famous name, Reginald Riddell. He was another one of these people that served in both houses, and Bruce and I have known quite a number of people that have done it over the years, but it is quite remarkable that this number of Gawler-based people also did that. Reg Riddell served in the House of Assembly in the seat of Barossa from 1933 to 38, and then in the seat of Angus from 1938 to 1944, and following on from that he then transferred to what was then the Midland District in the Legislative Council. So there were 5 districts in the Legislative Council at that stage. There was Northern and Southern, which were purely country districts. There was Midland, which was largely country, but as Adelaide grew, the north of Adelaide grew, then a lot of that was included in Midland. And then the bulk of the metropolitan area was Central Number 1 and Central Number 2. Is that right, Bruce? Yeah. And each of those areas elected 4 members. But Reg Riddell, lawyer and politician, was born in Gawler in 1885 and died in North Adelaide on the 1st of January 1955. And he actually died in office. He spent some time in the Australian Imperial Force in World War I, and then returned to his practice, his law practice in Gawler, and lectured in constitutional law at the University of Adelaide from 1920 to 25. In July 1933, he stood as the Liberal and Country League's candidate for Barossa and was elected, as I said, to the House of Assembly. As a backbencher, he was a fiscal conservative, but he supported the development of free public libraries in South Australia. With the abolition of multi-member electorates, which I had mentioned earlier, he then stood for the seat of Angus and won that in March 1938. After Sir Thomas Playford became Premier in November 1938, Riddell was immediately elevated to the Cabinet. As Commissioner of Crown Lands from 38 to 44, Minister of Lands 1944 to 46, Minister of Repatriation 38 to 46, and Minister of Irrigation 38 to 46. He was involved in the soldier settlement scheme in the state that bore the scars of earlier unsuccessful efforts. His credentials as a returned soldier and his open-minded and judicious approach alleviated criticism when bureaucratic and financial problems with the federal government and his own department delayed the selection and purchase of suitable land. And look, recently I heard a presentation about soldier settlement on Kangaroo Island after the Second World War, and certainly there is a very good book around about that, and that actually highlighted very much the problems that Mr. Riddell had to deal with, both with his own bureaucracy and the federal government. He shared a great sympathy for returned soldiers and took the task on with a real sense of personal responsibility. Mr. and Mrs. Riddell lost both of their sons during the war. Peter went down in the HMAS Sydney, and John was killed in action in New Guinea. His main work was to lie within the field of education. He was Minister for Education from
from 1946 until 1953. In the post-war era, he had difficult problems in providing enough schools and teachers for the rapidly growing numbers of children. There was also great difficulties, I think, where getting the materials and labour to build and extend schools. He was remembered well, however, for, in that period of time, visiting, if not all, just about all of the schools in the state. And most people in this room would probably recall that, you know, certainly in my young days, I mean, there was a school, particularly in country areas, every few miles. So there were a lot of little one-teacher schools around South Australia for him to go and visit. Colleagues described him as a tremendous worker at anything he took up, and once he undertook a project, no one could do it better. Education was his great interest in the latter years of his life. For it, he worked unremittingly, and he battled in the face of all kinds of difficulties, even when his health was failing. He was Attorney General he was also the Attorney General from 1946 until his death in January 1955. As I said, he died in office and was given a state funeral on the 4th of January. So they didn't waste any time. He died on the 1st of January and they had the state funeral 3 days later. So it was probably a heat wave, I suspect. We now come to a little bit closer to the current era and the person I now speak about. I haven't written a lot down about him, but he was my father. Maynard Boyd Dawkins, known as Boy, was born in Mount Lofty in 1917 and died in Adelaide on the 21st of October 1996. And I know a number of people here knew my father. He was elected to the Legislative Council for the Midland District in March 1962 and served in that role until July 1975, when the system of election was changed, and so the districts were abolished. And as is the case today, we are, elected across the whole state. He then served under that system for another 7 years. Dad had significant experience in the agricultural sector, particularly in stud sheep breeding and administration and local government as a councillor and chairman of the District Council of Muddler-Wirra. Who's heard of the District Council of Muddler-Wirra? Oh, that's good. Some of you probably live in the 100 of Muddler-Wirra, I suspect. And in choral music as a renowned conductor and soloist. He had long links with the Liberal and Country League, going back to his father and mother, who were both stalwarts of Liberal, the Liberal Union, I think it was, Bruce, in earlier days. And of course, his father, who was known as Bert, he was A.M. Dawkins. He actually ran for one of those multi-member seats in Barossa when they elected 4 and he finished 5th. So there was a bit of politics in the system going back a way. So look, one of the things that I'm always very proud of is that when we see the different schemes, and another one being announced recently about bringing more Bolivar water out for irrigation, one of the first things that Dad spoke about in the Parliament in 1962 was about getting water from Bolivar out into treated water and stopping it going out into the Gulf and getting it out so the horticulturalists could use it, the market gardening, and we've seen what's happened, but there's never been enough of it utilised. There's obviously a proposal to use a lot more of it. It's just at the moment a lot of the people that want to use it can't afford it at that rate. So that's an argument that will go on for a while. Dad served as whip, both in government and opposition, for a number of years. He was one of the committees that he served on for some time was the Land Settlement Committee, which wouldn't get much favour today because obviously we've become more environmentally conscious, and I suppose we've now got to the stage where we've opened up a lot of the land that probably may have been cleared and shouldn't have been cleared has been left as national park, and there is some country that probably shouldn't have been cleared. However, there were some parts on Kangaroo Island that Dad always felt should have been opened up to farming, and I just wonder, having driven through some of that area recently, to see the way a lot of that country that was cleared was replanted to blue gums, and they've got the issue now that they've got all the mature blue gums, and they've got to try and get them off the island at some stage, and that's causing some issues. I divert, sir, but these are related issues, I think, that people would like to know. The other one relevant, I think, to Gawler is that my father exhibited sheep at the Gawler show for more than 50 years. He certainly started as a young man and was involved helping me right up until his death. I don't know how much help he gave me at the end, but he was there anyway. He thought he was assisting, but his love of stud stock was evident and has come through the generations. I also go now to someone else that didn't actually like me. My father lived at Gawler River. This chap lived a bit further west. Les Hart was born and lived for most of his life in the Two Wells area. He was actually born in Adelaide in 1909 and died in Malala in 2002. Les was elected to the Legislative Council in October 1962 and then lost his seat in March 1973. Also a member for Midland, and someone that Bruce knew well Bruce knew Les and my father well, not only through politics, but being their veterinarian and treating their precious stud animals. Les Hart established the Glendevon sheep stud, Dorset Horn stud, in 1925 with his father. He was a wool classer, overseer, well-respected sheep judge, as well as his other achievements that included being a councillor on the District Council of Malala. He was chairman of that council, chairman of the Malala Hospital Board and the local ambulance board. He also played football and cricket for Two Wells, and when a bit over 30 years ago, in 1986, I was asked to write the history of the Two Wells Football Club. Yeah, I was charged with writing a history of a body that started formally in 1911, and a lot of its records had been lost in a fire. So that created some issues for me, but I'm sorry about it. But Les Hart, who had been a relatively young man, young but had a great memory of the people who were involved, and had some photos from the early days and some great stories. So he was able to help me do that work. What is now a long time ago when I did that. Les was very involved, obviously, in the Liberal Party. He was the first South Australian to actually be given the honour of honorary federal vice president, and he served on the Industries Development Committee and other committees. But like my father, he showed sheep at the Gawler show for over 50 years, and he also was always very interested to the end. We now move to Cecil Creedon. Cess Creedon was born in Westbury in Tasmania in March 1922. He died in South Australia in August 2014, and Cess served in the Legislative Council from March 73 until December 1995. He was a passionate Labor man, but I always got on very well with him, and he was one of the first people that congratulated me when I got elected to the Legislative Council. He was well known as obviously as a councillor in Gawler and then mayor for 6 years from 1972 to 78. Obviously he well known for the dry cleaning business that he ran, and he was the chairman or president of the Gawler Adult Education Centre. He had run as a candidate for the Legislative Council in 1962 and 1968, which was an optimistic proposition, but as I said, as the northern suburbs of Adelaide grew, then the prospects of the Labor Party in the seat of Midland also grew, and so he was elected, as I said, in 1973, and it was the first time a Labor member had won a Legislative Council seat what was described as outside the metropolitan area. I mean, all of that area now we would say was metropolitan. He was, I suppose, well known for a few things. In 1975 he protested against a decision of the South Australian Full Court that overturned a decision by the Credit Tribunal to allow customers of large stores to inspect their credit files. In 1976 he protested against reports that the Fraser government would close down the Australian Housing Corporation. He told Parliament the Housing Corporation provided bridging finance for home buyers at low interest rates. His term was marked by controversy and bravery. He declined to take the oath on the Bible. Now, a number of members don't take an oath on the Bible these days, although I think still the majority do, or they may do on some other holy book. But certainly in the days when Cess did it, it was controversial, and so he took an oath of allegiance to the Queen rather than swearing on the Bible. He was also well known for famously scuttling a key law reform bill when he was on the phone and failed to hear the bells calling for him to vote. There was a reintroduction of that piece of legislation later and it passed into law. He also objected to the prefix of honourable, which is something that is given to members of the Legislative Council as soon as you're elected, and if you serve more than 10 years you actually get to apply to keep it. But Cess didn't like it at all, and he apparently on 4 occasions he climbed onto a chair and removed the letters above his office door. Another one that didn't actually live in Gawler, but close by, was Brian Chatterton. Brian Chatterton was born in Calcutta, India in 1941 and is still living. He served in the Legislative Council from 1973 to 1987, again in the seat of Midland, and was a member of the Australian Labor Party. So he had an English father and an Australian mother, and they moved back to Adelaide when he was a child. He attended St Peter's College. For some period of his youth, his father was back working in India, Brian spent some time in India and the UK. He graduated from university in 1963, returned to take over the family property, Riverside at Lyndoch. After farming, his family had a long history of involvement in South Australian politics. Sir Charles Harvey Bagot was his great-grandfather. He was first appointed and later elected to the first Legislative Council. Sir Henry Ayres was his great-great-grandfather and was Premier and later President of the Legislative Council. Edwin Barrett was a great-grandfather and he was also a member of the House of Assembly. Brian was elected to the Legislative Council in 1973, as I said, firstly in Midland and then obviously under the statewide provisions. In fact, under those provisions, he became number one on the Labor Party's Legislative Council team. He was Minister of Agriculture, Forests and Fisheries in the Dunstan government in 1975. He held those portfolios until the defeat of the Corcoran government in 1979. During the period of Labor opposition, he was Shadow Minister for those portfolios and then went back into the ministry with those responsibilities when the Bannon government took power in 1982. He resigned his portfolios in April 1983, citing lack of support from the Premier. After he resigned from Parliament in 1987, he became a consultant for medic farming systems in dryland farming zones, and his biography, Roosters and Feather Dusters, is available for loan in the Parliamentary Library. Now, I just wanted to mention the Gordon family, and we are going to go back in history a bit, but it is a very interesting, and Bruce has been very helpful tonight, but he couldn't sort of add to what I know about the Honourable Sir John Gordon as far as his relationship to the rest of the Gordon family. But I think he's a brother and an uncle. But he was born in Kilmalcolm, Scotland in 1850. He arrived in Gawler in 1861. After having arrived in the colony 3 years earlier, his father became a pastor of the Presbyterian Church. He practiced law in Strathalbyn. He was called to the bar. He was a member of the Legislative Council from 1988 to 1903, when he was elevated to the position of Judge of the Supreme Court, which he then went on to hold for some 20 years. He was the first president of the Commonwealth Club in Adelaide, which was founded in 1910. He was a member of the convention which framed the Federal Constitution in Adelaide in 1897, and if you come to Parliament House, I'll show you a photograph of the delegates to that convention, which was held out the back of what's now the old building. He was Minister for Education and of the Northern Territory from 27 June 1889 to August 1890. So that was the days when the Northern Territory was part of South Australia's administration. He became a Queen's Counsel in 1900 and was knighted in 1908. We then go to the Honourable Sir David Gordon, who was actually born in Riverton, and this family had connections with Gawler, around Gawler to the north, and also out to the east in the near Adelaide Hills area. But a very interesting story. He was first a journalist with the Register for approximately 20 years. During his time at the Register, he was 15 years commercial and financial editor-in-chief of the reporting staff, and he was also leader of Hansard in the Parliament. He was a member of the House of Representatives in the federal parliament for the seat of Boothby from 1911 to 1913 when he was defeated. He was a member of the Legislative Council from 1913 to 1944. So he resurrected his career and stayed for a long time. He served a short time as Minister of Education, Minister of Repatriation in mid-1917, but resigned when he refused to join a coalition. He was leader of the Liberal Party in the Legislative Council from 1918 until 1932. He was President of the Legislative Council for 12 years, from 1932 to 1944. And then we come to Douglas Gordon, who was Sir David's son. He was a member of the Legislative Council. He was born at Semaphore in 1892. He died in 1948. He died after a short illness while he was in office. He was the eldest son, as I said, of the Honourable Sir David Gordon. He was president of the Liberal and Country League from 1943 to 46, and a foundation member of the Federal Council of the Liberal Party of Australia, because it was in 1944. That means he's brought together all of the, how many were there, Bruce? There were any number of different entities that were brought together to form the Liberal Party of Australia. He was a member of the first AIF, serving in Egypt and Gallipoli. His service record is detailed in much of the other detail that I will provide to you. But he did, unfortunately, only served in the Parliament for just short of around about 18 months before he died. The last one I will mention is Henry Edward Bright. He was a member of the House of Assembly for the electorates of Stanley and Warroora. Stanley and Warroora were both to the north of here, weren't they, Bruce? I suppose Warroora would have been more around the Balaclava area, I suspect, and Stanley was more up in the Clare, yes. So he was elected 4 times in Stanley between 1865 and 1871. So as I say, they had a lot of elections in those days because the governments didn't hold together that well. And then he was elected in Warroora in 1875, 78, 81, in 81. He then went to the Legislative Council in what was then called District Number 3, which was also known as Northeastern Province. He was born in London, died in Gawler. He worked on the gold fields, and he had a stock dealing and butchering business in Gawler. And Bruce tells me that both Bright Terrace and Bright Street are both named after him. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that hasn't been too long, but I wanted to give you as much detail as I could. I think there's some fascinating history in that. I have got some hard copies here, but Brian says that it will be put up on the website. If there is any more detail that you'd like about members of Parliament in general, we can find that, because the library is very helpful in that regard. And as I say, I would like to reiterate my offer that if this group at some stage would like to come to Parliament, we'll certainly give you a trip around the building in general, but the current librarian, he's not a librarian, but he's the director of the research library, is very proud of the library and what they have there, and there are some fascinating pieces of history. So with that, thank you very much for having me, and happy to try and ask any questions if there is time for that. But I thoroughly enjoyed putting together that work, and as I say, look forward to leaving some of the information with you, which includes a lot of the I suppose, the places to go and find more information. Thank you very much.
John? Questions, please. Any questions for John?
That water pipe that you're talking about that will run near your factory or your
Farm?
was that a wooden water pipe?
No, it was, well, whether it was the original one that I saw, I mean, certainly the markings were the originals, and it may have been wooden in the earlier days.
Well, it was wooden, the one that went from Dead Man's Pass, pumped through the Wadsworth, and I happened to have some of that, you know, the original timber.
Yeah, look, I think by the time I came along, they may have replaced it. Certainly the original markers were there, which indicated the Barossa Waterworks and when it was laid, which was in that late 1800s, early 1900s, which was remarkably earlier.
Did Mr. Bright have a brick kiln in Williston?
The question is, did Mr. Bright have a brick kiln in Williston?
Well,
there
was a brick, sorry.
It was father and son, I think.
Well, Bruce knows more about the history of Mr. Bright than I do, but did he have the brick kiln?
I believe so. I can't define it definitely, but the fact of it being mentioned struck a memory in my mind. I'll find out more.
Bruce will find out more.
Excellent.
Because it was weaker and bright.
Just in relation to that,
On the mic, Bruce.
just in relation to that, Bright was responsible for building the home up in Bright Street, Williston, in which I lived between 1952 and 1982. And in between times, there was another Member of Parliament lived in the house. It was the late Les Duncan, who was there immediately before Jack Clark, and passed away probably in about, I think it was 1952 or thereabouts.
Thank you, Bruce. Any other questions? Any other questions?
John,
Paul?
there was a Rowley Chatterton that lived in Gawler,
Yeah.
who still does. Was that the son of Brian?
I think Rowley was Rowley a nephew of Brian's? Rowley Chatterton was a councillor, his brother.
Brother.
Okay, I knew he wasn't son, but no, he was brother. Younger, must have been.
That was a great pick out there.
All right. Yeah, no, Rowley was a councillor in Gawler for. Well, he would have coincided with you, Brian. I think, did he?
No, before me.
Earlier.
He was a vineyard too, because I bought some Chesterton wines, I remember years ago.
Yes, they did Lindon. You got a question, Mr. Barnes?
No, I haven't.
Oh, I thought you did.
Brian's
No.
wanting me to
Wrap it up.
No, vote it. Bring the basket over.
Not wrap it up, he's asking.
look on behalf of the
Wait. I've got a vision. Wait a minute.
I've known this bloke since he was about 12 years old.
Right, there you go. Where you go?
On behalf of the Gawler History team, I'd like to show appreciation to the Honourable John Dawkins for his great rendition and parochial information on the Legislative Council.
No, it wasn't too parochial.
No, it was absolutely spectacular. Just bring out the family touch, and that's part of what the Gawler history is all about. It's about the locals knowing and learning more about what there is in our local history. And speaking to a ledge like yourself, sort of the Liberal whip, as well as being a member of the family tradition of farmers in this region, it's a very important part of our region, and it's an important part of Gawler's history as well. So it's always involved. So I'd like to show a vote of thanks with this basket for you, John. So I appreciate it. Just one little parochial attachment that I have, that my first day at school, I had to go to school on the train. I caught the train from Gawler to Adelaide, and on my first day on the train I was lost and I didn't know what was going on, and John was there, and I sat down with John when he was at school. It was his last year at school, and it was my first year at school.
I don't know that there's that much between us.
Maybe
I reckon I was in probably year, what do they call it now? Year 10 or
Leaving?
Year 10 or 11 I would have been in, yeah.
leaving.
Intermediate or leaving.
Oh, well, sorry, much younger than...
It's good there's no young ones here, they wouldn't know what I was talking about.